Hi everyone, this is Integration Talks, the only podcast dedicated to software integration and integration experts. It is hosted by Francis Martens from Exalate, the most powerful integration app. Let's get started.
Good morning, good day, or good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to a new episode of the Integration Talks, where we focus on anything related with integration systems altogether. So during the talks, we will invite experts to live events to discuss various topics that are of interest for people who are looking into integrating different systems. And today I have Boris Berenberg from Atlas Authority here. And hi, Boris. How have you been doing?
Hey, Francis. Thanks a lot for having me on today. I'm in sunny Lima today, and just happy to be having this conversation with you.
Okay, all right. So can you tell something about Atlas Authority? What's Atlas Authority? What's your specialization?
Sure. For context, I'm the CEO of Atlas Authority. We are a Atlassian Gold Enterprise Solution Partner, which I think means that we basically won buzzword bingo at this point. But what that means in practice is that we help organizations implement, scale, and get maximum value out of Atlassian applications. Mm-hmm. And as that relates to integration talks, a lot of what we do is not only, hey, how do I get Jira to do X, but how do I get Jira to do X in collaboration with another team or another tool or another process. So there's a lot of work around connecting different systems and connecting different processes and connecting different teams to hit business objectives.
Okay, all right. Yeah, especially whenever you do integrations, knowing something that other people have encountered or learned is of a lot of value, because integrations can get complex, right?
So I think integrations always get complex. The simplest example, actually, I think for that is the native Jira SAML integration in Data Center, where I remember when it first came out, a lot of our customers said, "Oh man, now we have native SAML. We don't need any third-party apps, nothing. We just installed Jira, we just connected the SAML, and we're done." And you'd think like, yeah, sure, super easy. And I don't know a single one of our customers that uses that native integration today, right? Every single one of them was like, oh yeah, it'll be this easy authentication thing. And then they're like, oh, we had a reorg. Does this SAML integration actually sync the information into Jira in such a way that it handles the reorg? It always gets messy. And in the case of SAML, all of our customers ended up moving to third-party SAML integrations that allowed them to handle more robust scenarios, more complex scenarios, the edge cases that were being introduced by other teams, right? Because the data in their IDP is not owned by the Jira team. They don't get to make those decisions. So, integrations are always that bridge to connect the tension.
Exactly. But integrations is a really wide concept. It could, like you're saying, like SAML integration is an example, or you could say like integrating with other systems, like other operational systems, is another one. So
yeah, absolutely. We're frequently seeing customers. I would say that there's two parts of integration that are interesting to me, and they're interesting separately, right? One is the like, hey, how do we technically integrate A with B, right? And that's like, how do we integrate Jira with, let's say, Zendesk, right? Where you have a customer support process, and then you escalate that to development, and you need to collaborate between those two systems. I think that's one part of it, right? The other part of it is, when does it make sense to integrate from a team and people perspective, right? Like, should you keep using Zendesk, or should you move to Jira Service Management, or should you, do something else? And I think that today, we do a lot of figuring out kind of both sides of that, right? So hopefully that's helping to.
Yeah. So we have these discussions also in our projects. Is would it be better to integrate the systems like Zendesk with Jira, or just move the Zendesk users to Jira Service Management? To give you an example, because then you would have just one Jira instance which contains all the logic, and which is easier to manage. What would be like the decision points to go one way or the other way?
Yeah, and I think that's a great question. The way that we look at it is that if we want to, I'm trying to think the best way to say this. Ultimately, it's about driving business value. I think that's the important thing, right? And so you need to kind of understand who sees what value from each of the different tools, right? If you're asking a customer service team to move from Jira Service, from Zendesk to Jira Service Management, for example, then you need to be able to not only demonstrate the value of, hey, we have this now in one system, there's no need for any kind of special integration, et cetera. I mean, granted, you still kind of do need automations, et cetera. So it's quasi not integrated. But you have to really understand, are we taking that value? And are we offering them something so much more that the pain of shifting is worth it, right? And then you have to remember that this means you have to retrain all of the customers on how to interact with the system. You have to retrain all of your agents on how to interact with the system. You have to understand what kind of external integrations you have amongst these systems that, hey, if you have some plugin for Zendesk that, I don't know, let's say it does specialty knowledge bases, right?
Yeah.
So now you're like, okay,
recording, time recording example.
There's a million things that you can extend, these other tools with. And then it's like, okay, so now I need to migrate that over. And then that snowballs into, well, okay, now I have to retrain the users of that thing. And what integrations does that thing have? And so it can be very, very disruptive to business processes to have that.
Exactly.
Now, the flip side is typically one word, and that's reporting, right? Reporting across multiple systems is very, very hard. Even reporting within one system is hard, but reporting across systems is this, magic unicorn that every executive wants. And so the majority of the time when we see a true, like what I would call non-beneficial migration, right? Which is like you're going from A, you're going to B, there's not really a drastic benefit to the organization from making that change. The majority of the time that is done is because you have a senior individual who wants to have uniform reporting and visibility across an organization, and they can't find cross-application tooling that supports that. I think with developers, like with developers even, right? Like forget even the whole organization, right? Just development. I think there's a company called Jellyfish. I always forget if it's Jellyfish or Jellyfin or something like that. But they're like, oh, we connect to Jira, we connect to GitHub, we connect to your CI/CD, we connect to all these things. And then we can like tell you if engineers are performing or not. Well, okay, great. You've collected all these systems, you've got all this data, but like, can you actually now compare if engineers are doing good work or not, right? Like how many lines of code is worth a pull request, right? So you get into these interesting situations, and I think that the idea is that by centralizing work in a single system, it makes it easier to compare output and inputs for management teams.
That's just for reporting, right? So
that's the number one reason that we've seen.
I mean, in many cases, as we are focusing on cross-company integrations, it's not possible. You can't ask your customer to switch from Zendesk to your Jira service management, right? So
absolutely, absolutely.
And,
It's a huge thing, right? I think one of our customers where they use Exalate actually. So they're a large tech company. Everybody knows the brand, but what they do is they have an outsourced QA team and an outsourced translations team.
okay.
And so what they're actually doing is it's a QA team for a specific sub product. It's a niche need, right? So, but the point is this is an external company, right? The external company works with a number of clients like ours. The translation provider is very similar, right? They're an external company. They work with a number of customers similar to our customer. And what we realized was look, for security and privacy reasons, we can't let our customer have access to their systems because they have competitors and whatnot in there, right? Mm-hmm. And our customer can't let their providers into their system because there's way more data in there than they should have access to. And messing with all the permissioning in this case, it happens to all be Jira in every instance, but messing with the permissioning would be very complicated and disruptive to all the other stakeholders within the organization. So in that case, we actually did a Exalate back and forth sync where we're able to make sure that the information that's being shared back and forth is limited to the scope of what these vendors should be seeing, and also complies with the various data classification policies that our customer has in place.
Yeah. So that's pretty interesting. So one of the discussions we have is also what's a minimal integration functionality that an integration platform should be able to deliver, because integrations can get really complex with all the business rules that you have to implement, and you could either start to implement it completely from the get-go, or start small and then improve on the capabilities of that integration itself. And so we're wondering what would be the minimal the MVP of such integration be, right?
I think that's a great question. I think there's really kind of two bits to that I would break out. One is what's the MVP of an integration, right? And then the second part is what are the capabilities of an integration provider that you care to lean into, right? And I don't think they're necessarily perfectly tied. I think there's oftentimes a conversation that we'll have with a customer around hey, we want to integrate A and B, and we start doing discovery, and we're looking at, okay, this is going to be a big project. There's a lot of processes we need to understand. There's a lot of requirements we need to understand. And they're like, look, that's fine, but I just need A to talk to B today while we do the rest of this, right? And the tool that oftentimes gets picked for that is Zapier, or I'm blanking on the name because they just rebranded. It was called Integromat. I think now it's called Work.com or something like that. They just
really like a workflow automation solution.
Yeah, and so the nice thing about these tools is that it's very much aligned with the no code movement, right? Where a project manager, or maybe like a data scientist, or someone who's got a good understanding of what's going on in the business, someone that understands the business need and the business value delivered, right? And someone that typically is at least a little bit technical, right? They go in and they're able to actually drive MVP to be delivered pretty quickly with these tools, right? The problem that happens then, and this is kind of why I wanted to separate this idea of MVP versus the tooling that supports it, is that once they build it out, depending on the tool, there's different degrees of how long it will work for them. For example, like I think Zapier, pretty short lifespan in terms of the complexity that you want to introduce into a process. Again, I don't remember Integromat's new name, but there it can support a more complex life cycle. But it becomes very, very difficult to manage, because now you're drawing these diagrams, and how do you troubleshoot it? Well, you have to like rerun everything, and there's like, to troubleshoot certain steps, you have to like now have special destinations where you send state, it gets into this kind of very messy situation to maintain beyond a certain degree. And the place where it ultimately fails, regardless of what these tools support, is once you hit security and compliance, right? This is especially with multi-customer systems, right? Like if source and destination, I should say, A and B, right? Because they can both be sources and destinations. But if A and B are in different organizations, right? They're both going to have organizational autonomy and authority over security policies of what data classification and what can go where. And unfortunately, like Zapier, Integromat, all of these tools, like none of them are thinking about this model. And I think that at that point you tend to get into pretty specialized tooling, right? Like in the Atlassian ecosystem, Atlas Authority tends to use Exalate for that. I know that there's other tooling in other ecosystems, but that's not kind of where our focus is. But you do end up with kind of this specialized tooling.
Yeah. So you've been focusing on the tooling, like the minimal functionality that the tool should be delivering. But to comment on the other one, what's the MVP of an integration? So I would just I create an issue here. There's an incident there. Would that be sufficient? What are the challenges there?
I would say, as the makers of iframes for Confluence on the Atlassian Marketplace.
What's iframes for Confluence? Sorry.
It literally is a macro that you can insert into Confluence that adds an iframe, and then you put a URL, and whatever you want shows up.
And that's
right?
It. Okay.
That's, in my mind, that is your minimal integration, right? You just take whatever data you can and you just plop it in context, right? No syncing, no anything, right? Like that's truly the minimum integration, is just let people have access to the information they need side by side. I think after that, you get into the state of, hey, like rather than just like lazy embed things, let's have the capability of like actually seeing it natively in a tool, right? I think, a good example of this would be Elements Connect, right? Or Elements Connect. It used to be called MFeed, right? So you have a Jira issue, you have some remote data source. When you open the issue, it makes a query, dynamically pulls in the value of whatever API you hit, or SQL Server, whatever, and you just see it there, right? It's one step beyond that iframe, because you have a little bit of smarts about what you're pulling in. You're doing it natively within the UX of the product, but it's still not really in Jira. I think Elements Connect actually does do some caching. So that's, like asterisk, but you get where I'm going with it, right?
Yeah, you still need the connectivity between the two systems
Exactly.
to get the information, right?
Right. And then I think, from there, then the next stage becomes, okay, like if A happens in source system, right? And A can be an event or a schedule or whatever, right? Then B, like copy data into B, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then from there, you basically can layer on everything, right? So from there, you can then say, okay, well, A to B, can B go to A, right?
Yeah,
The moment you
the
have that,
bidirectional.
yeah, now you have a bidirectional sync. Now you're like, okay, well, how do we stop loops, right? Because
Yeah,
like
yeah,
if you use like Zapier, right, or use Integromat, like this is one of the very first problems you hit. Is like, how do you stop a loop when you're
yeah.
doing a bidirectional sync?
Well,
And
sorry to interrupt there. It did happen with any tool, like also with Exalate, you can create a connection A to B, but also from B to A. And so one of our
yep,
customers was saying, "Hey, Francis, this thing is just generating thousands of issues in a couple of hours." So yeah,
yep.
you have to be
And
careful with this type of tools, right?
I think you have to be careful. I think it's also a matter of the tools building the heuristics to detect these
Mm,
loops, right? Like, for example, Jira's incoming email handler, right? By
mhm.
the way, one of the methods of integration, MVP, right? You take
Yeah,
two email systems, you point them at one another. That's one of the
yeah.
easiest ways of integrating. But for example, Jira wants to protect a infinite loop happening between two service desks, right?
Hmm.
Because my service, like you could sign up for my service desk using your service desk's email, right?
Yeah,
That would send an email to you, you would send an email to me, and we'd have an infinite loop going back and
yeah.
forth. So what they've done is they've placed a header in the outgoing emails, and on the incoming parser, they watch for that header and they say, hey, if this is being sent from another Jira service desk, like we just don't process it basically.
Yeah. True.
Um, so I think that there is a certain amount of responsibility that I would place on the relevant tool that's doing
Hmm.
the synchronization. Um, but yeah, it's also you have like no matter how smart the tool is, you can come up with a configuration that'll break it, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah. So something we learned also is that whenever two teams need to work together, um, the tool is only like 5% of the effort. Right? So just
Yeah,
get the team know what the mutual cooperation model is. It takes quite a bit of time.
yeah, absolutely. And I mean, this is, I would say, in some ways, the strength and the weakness of like Exalate in particular, right? Is like Exalate has this like very rich bidirectional configuration, which allows both sides to have autonomy, right? But it does mean, for example, that if we want to push out a configuration change, we need system owners on both sides to push it out at the same time.
Hmm.
And that, that can be challenging sometimes because it now, even something as simple as like, oh, we want to make a configuration change, but now we need that simply the scheduling conflicts, right? Can be challenging. Um, Never mind the like understanding of, hey, what field values do you guys have? What field values do we have? How do we negotiate those? How do we negotiate those? And you have to do them basically personally, because if the tool were to share the information, it would then violate its security promises,
Yeah, there
right?
you go. Yeah.
So it's actually it's a very challenging problem for your team, I think, from a product management perspective, because you
Mm.
have to balance like the usability and the how much can you help teams collaborate on that configuration while also not compromising the security guarantees that you've made to those teams.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, true. So I do know that this is not solvable by the tool itself, because there's a lot of semantic related to it. Like if you talk about a workflow orchestration between two teams, and I witnessed discussions that took hours about what does it mean if you reopen an issue, right?
I mean, hey, you don't even need integration for that. I've seen that conversation happen for hours in a single Jira system, right? Like,
yeah, right.
You know, the value of a shared taxonomy, right? A shared vocabulary, a shared understanding of process is super important. I used to joke that one of our most profitable engagements that we used to sell for consulting was what I called babysitting, which is we would, pre-pandemic, we would go to a customer's site, we would get consent from their senior leadership, we would take all the important stakeholders for a process and lock them in a conference room for a week and take away their laptops and phones and everything. And then we would just give them like markers, dry erase markers, and we would have them draw the entire process end to end, every single input, every single output, every single role involved, everything on a giant whiteboard, right? And at the end of the day, we just take a picture of it, wipe it down, keep going the next day. The number of times that we would do an engagement like this where, stakeholders would be like, oh, I had no idea we did that. Like, this is a process that these people are working with day in and day out for years, and they have no understanding of core processes that happen within the organization. It's really challenging to get everybody on that same page, and it takes a lot of work. And I mean, hell, I don't even have to talk about other companies. I can tell you, like, internally, right? At Atlas Authority, I would say the number one cause of waste, like wasted work, is a lack of shared understanding of what's going on.
Indeed. Taxonomy is like the first step. Whenever you talk about an issue, you all know what an issue is, right?
Hey, I mean, that's the old one, right? It's like, I didn't really do a long intro on myself, but I used to work at Atlassian, and I remember when we were there was a big discussion. I was firmly on the side of renaming what an object in Jira is called, right? So Jira calls it an issue. The word issue means something very specific in certain contexts, right? And so if you're like, I forget what it is. I think it's like in a IT service management context or something, like issue means something specific. And so if anybody in that context was like, well, if I'm creating a bug, why am I clicking create new issue, right? And so at the time, there was a big discussion of like, well, if we rename the object, what should we call it? Because if we call it a story, that's going to be wrong for most people, right? If we call it, and there was essentially no consensus on what to call it. And the only real thing that got any steam was to call it a Jira, because that's what a lot of customers call it. A lot of customers are like, go create a Jira, right? So depending on, some customers call it a Jira, but but a lot of customers will actually refer to the object in Jira as a Jira. And so the idea was, if we call that object a Jira, then it makes sense because it's a meaningless word, right? There's not like, not somebody in IT or not somebody in customer support or some other department that's going to be like, oh, that word means something to me. And so I think the use of Jira there was a large group of people arguing for it, but they decided against it. And if you look, the solution that they went for is they just remove any label as much as possible. So now it just says like create or like plus or like new, right? So it doesn't say create what, it just says create. I think it's a smart solution that they've taken from a UX perspective to create kind of that, shared vocabulary.
We had the same problem. So initially, actually, it was syncing issues. But once that we expanded into ServiceNow, which has like 3,000 different type of objects, we start to talk about entities, which is like a more technical term of such a thing.
Yeah.
But, so we started this creating common ground by defining a taxonomy where all the terms are being defined. In a cross-company setup, that's more difficult, of course, especially when whenever you're integrating like a German with a French company, it's really interesting discussions that you see there.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think you bring up an interesting point, right? Is I think everything we've talked up until now, we're saying, hey, you got to map company A to company B, and that's assuming the language is the same, right?
Yeah.
It's already complicated if they're both speaking English or both speaking German or whatever. The moment you introduce, different languages, it becomes more complex. And I would say that there's even a third layer, which is if you're working across like wildly different cultures, not just languages, right? Where like there's like even, getting people to agree on like, hey, this is, a story versus a story. Sure, that's a language thing. But what does fast mean in Germany versus Brazil? Right? Well, I mean, if you want to have a meeting fast in Germany, it'll be the same day. If you want a meeting fast in Brazil, it could be the same week.
Right.
It's very, very different, and it's a completely cultural thing. So even once you've aligned on like, hey, what are the words we want to use? What do they mean? Is a whole different situation.
The same is with priorities. Yeah, if you say major or critical, so critical, everything is critical for a customer, right?
I've never had a non-critical issue.
Okay, all right. No. So okay. So how do you contain this? That's something. I assume that you have such a project where you have to create that cross-company integration. How do you make this work?
It's a great question. I don't know. No, I'm joking. Never made it. No. Look, I think that whether it's integration or the deployment of it or the tool you pick or any of these things, right? Everybody wants a silver bullet, right? Unfortunately, there's not a silver bullet. The answer is it's going to be messy, right? And that the goal here isn't, to be perfect. The goal here for us typically is, I don't know how many people have gone bowling, but in bowling, you can get like these things put on the side of the lane so the ball can't fall off into the gutter. So, I think that's our main objective, is just to set boundaries so that no matter what's happening, the ball always keeps moving forward and never derails entirely. And it's not so much about like, hey, let's roll the ball perfectly. I think that the big thing that we found is just, and this is actually any project, is make sure you really got the right stakeholders, right? Like it's super duper easy to get the easy stakeholders and not the right stakeholders involved. So make sure you really have the right stakeholders on both sides. This means that they should have executive authority, right? These are not people who are like, oh yeah, let me get a committee of 20 people to confirm, blah, blah, blah. No, the person needs to be able to make decisions, both from a authority perspective, as well as a personality perspective, right? Like you can get a CEO who's unwilling to make decisions. That doesn't help you, right? Like if he's going to make, or she is going to make decisions by committee, it's still the wrong stakeholder. Now, following that, you also need to get the right non-executive stakeholders involved, right? You do need the people to provide input, but you need to make sure that that's happening in a structured manner, right? So you need to come to the stakeholders with specific questions and with specific options for them to pick from, right? This isn't like, you probably shouldn't be going in and doing massive brainstorming sessions that are completely unplanned. Especially, pro tip, never do group brainstorming. brainstorming should be done individually, and then everybody brings ideas once they've brainstormed.
Right.
Don't do group brainstormings. It just goes nowhere. It's like one person will have an idea and then everybody will just talk about that idea for the rest of the time. So do your brainstorming, right? Figure out what you're presenting, have your options, present it. Once you've done this, right, then at some point, keep in mind that if you're working with multiple organizations, scheduling is your problem. So there's two main things here. One, standing meeting, right? Make it like essentially you say, hey, we're going to book X amount of time, every Y, right? That could be an hour a week, it could be an hour a day, it doesn't matter. It depends on the priority of the project, etc. Make it known that you should always expect to attend. Also make it known that it will be canceled like the morning of if it's not needed, right? So you basically build trust in both directions. You say, hey, if it's there, you kind of have to come. This isn't the meeting that you're going to be skipping. However, if there's not really anything to do, we will cancel it and give you your time back ahead of time so that you're not showing up to a meeting that doesn't have anything for you to do. Yeah. So, because time is the ultimate currency, right? Like it's the one thing you can't get more of. I can lose all my money and I can rebuild it, right? But I can't rebuild my time. So just being super respectful of other people's time, especially across organizations, is going to be the important bit. And then, you got to work the process. It's unfortunately there's not I would say it's like this very classic, like agile thing. You take what you have, you refine it, you refine it.
So you think an iterative approach on building up that integration would be a helpful thing to do?
I would say that Atlas Authority has a strong preference for iterative projects because we typically find, going back to that thing I said about the babysitting project, right, of dragging everybody into a room and speccing things out. Most people don't know their own requirements, right?
No.
So if we're going to go in and just do an iterative project, we can kind of like dynamically discover, build, etc. What we have done in the past is that we do these babysitting sessions, right? We charge customers a lot of money to come in and do this long and heavy discovery process. We, do that. Then we go in and do a long, heavy implementation phase of that. And then guess what? Enough time has passed that the goals have changed. Yep. And now we start doing iterative stuff. Ultimately, it's up to how the customer wants to do it. But we find that typically just set some basic guidelines in the beginning and run an iterative process from there is a typically better ROI approach for the customer than the heavy kind of waterfall that eventually leads into iterative anyway.
So what we learned with such an iterative approach is that because you didn't implement all the integrations, people will start complaining about this has not been implemented, that's not okay. And creating the right expectations within the whole team is a challenge on its own, because you can't, as an external company who's advising one or two or three companies involved in creating such an integration network, you can't be responsible for the communication within the individual teams itself, and so it's a bit of a uphill battle where you don't necessarily know what you're going to encounter. So
I absolutely agree. I think that's 100% correct. The main thing that I would add there is that in general, setting expectations, I think, is the number one job of consultants, right? Because you can make anybody happy if you set the expectations correctly, right? If you don't manage expectations, everybody's always going to be unhappy. So I do think that in general, it's just important for all consultants to understand that. But specifically when it comes to integrations, right? There's different ways of managing this delivery gap. right? And there's different ways of understanding what people are actually saying, right?
Mm-hmm.
When a team is coming to you and saying like, hey, you've integrated, let's say incidents and ServiceNow with Jira tickets, right? But you haven't integrated changes with Jira tickets.
Yeah, yeah.
Like,
For example,
what blah blah blah, right? And they're upset, whatever. What they're actually saying is, hey, we like what you've done over here. Why haven't we been given the same thing everybody else has been given, right? It's really this place of like it's coming out in frustration and anger. But what the actual driver for it is that they're happy with the rest of the work and they want the same thing. Which, if you think about it, that's like a great place to be, right?
Yeah.
Like you want people wanting your thing. So I think that the first thing is, it's easy to feel like you're getting beaten down by customers sometimes, and I think in this case, this is a good thing to see. And I think that, like you said, it is really about supporting communications, right?
Yeah.
And setting expectations. And we definitely work with our customers to make sure that if you're deploying something like this, like we want only one team at a time, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because we're gonna be kind of like, I would say that there is a spectrum of willingness to accept change amongst people, right? Some people really like change and they're like, I'll accept anything in order to make my life better. And some
Mm-hmm.
people are really afraid of change and they're going to say, hey, my life is good enough and I don't want to risk it getting worse, right?
That's
And there's
something.
nothing in between. And so I think when we do multi-team change, is typically like a company-wide thing, right? Like, forget even integration, right? Like company-wide, oftentimes they're like, oh, we want standard Jira workflows across everybody. Well, if you want standard Jira workflows across everybody, some got to go first. So who do you go first, right? And oftentimes they're going to say like, oh, well, let's do this team. They're not that, the project they're working on isn't that important, right? Obviously, nobody tells that team that, but it's like, this is what's actually happening in the executive
There's no impact
process. Yeah, they're like, oh, if they fail, who cares? So but that's the wrong way to do it, right? Because what you need in a process like this are stakeholders that are going to be actively engaged in discovery, communication, iteration, that are willing to lean into certain painful situations. So, for example, things will oftentimes get worse before they get better, right? You get this graph that looks like it dips down and then it comes back up. So the final result is better than where you started, but there is this pain point below it. So you need teams that are willing to pick up that slack, right? Because the tooling now got worse. So now they have to do more manual work in this little dip portion. And so if you get it, like I always say, we should prioritize by teams that are like begging to do it first, then people that are willing to do it second, and then people that don't want to do it last, right? And typically there's also different ways of like getting these teams to buy in, of especially at that last stage. One of the common things is like, you've already validated that it works in the first two stages, right? Like as a provider of whatever service, that what you're doing works with these two teams. So now you got to get this last team. And especially this last team, what I've found is that you basically give them what I call a parachute, right? Which is that like, hey, we're going to push you out of a plane, but we're going to give you a parachute that you can pull, right? Which is, hey, you commit to the new process for 6 months. If you don't like it, we'll move you back off. I've never had a single team ever ask to go to the old process, right? Because they're not actually afraid of the new process. They're not upset with the new process. They're just unwilling to take the disruption to their work to make the change, right? And they're unwilling to have the risk. So, I think that's that. When you're having that cross-team expectation setting, especially multi-company expectation setting, again, leaning into these people that are begging for change first, right? Then you're going to have the people that want it, that are going to have that upset, like, oh, you implemented theirs, but not ours. Then you're like, of course, we agree with you. You're right. Like, let us now help you, right? Like, you're our priority, right?
It's a problem turned into an opportunity, right? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then finally, right, you go to those holdouts and you say, like, look, we'll give you an out, right?
Yeah.
And you do need senior management to agree to, like, if they do it, like, you do have to keep your word, right? It's important to not lose trust. But you know, like I said, I've never actually had a single customer use it.
So can you comment on the turnaround time of doing such an integration?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, I was bored a few years ago, and I was wondering, hey, you know, I say this phrase a lot when I do work. It depends. So I went out and I got a trademark for it, and unfortunately, I think that's going to be the answer here. So you know, it does depend on the scope, right? It does depend on the number of teams. It does depend on the number or the types of entities that we're syncing, right? It depends on, like, what the tool. For example, like Jira to Jira is going to be easier, I think, in my mind at least, than Jira to ServiceNow or Jira to Zendesk or, you know, Salesforce or whatever, because at least in Jira the entity concepts are the same, right? I was having a call with someone earlier, and you know, they'd had experience deploying stuff in ServiceNow, and now they wanted Jira Service Management, and like they were asking me if, like, oh, can we have X feature in a change request? And I was like, yeah, in Jira they're all the same. Like, they're just labels in Jira. All the features are consistent. And they're like, oh, okay. I'm used to other tools where that's not the case, right? So I think that when you're doing, you know, like, it is going to really depend on the situation. I would say that if you want, like, a really, really basic, like, hey, we're just going to set up Jira bi-directional, like, we're not going to enforce any kind of actually, you know what I would say is, this is the best example I have, right? Sometimes you need a less private Jira. So you can have two Jira systems owned by the same organization with different permission systems for various reasons, right? And so you can have a project that is perfectly mirrored between those two, right? Workflows are identical, statuses are identical, all the fields, everything's identical. I think if you take a situation like that, you say, hey, we just want perfect bidirectional sync on these two, and we're not going to use user mapping, right? So it's just going to come across as whatever, you know, synchronization up. You know, you can set that up in an hour, maybe 2 hours, right? Like, but then, like, you want to layer on, like, user impersonation. Well, add some time. You want to have filtering so that only certain information goes one way or the other, right? Like, a common example is, in the internal one, we don't want comments that are private to go to this system, right? So only private. Yeah. So now you're like, okay, got to add another filter, right? And so the scope of work will just, you know, rapidly expand. I think, you know, whenever we talk with customers about durations, we always talk about two different durations. We talk about the billable hours that we charge them, right? We're a consulting company, obviously we care. And then we talk about calendar time, which is the duration they care about a lot more. And so I think that, for example, you know, if you're thinking about a project like this, you have to understand which changes influence which of those. For example, if you have that exact situation I described of, like, two identical systems, you know, everything bidirectional, no filtering, no nothing, that's pretty easy. But what if one of those is owned by another organization and you just need two sets of admins? The work hasn't increased, but the calendar time has just gotten, you know, a week longer just based on that. So I think it's just important to understand kind of which functionality that you want is going to influence which factors in terms of timing.
So it's indeed the right answer. It depends. Nice to know that you have the trademark.
Say again?
It's nice to know that you have the trademark on it depends.
Yeah. Well, I got
Can
the
I
domain
use it?
too.
Can I use it in my conversations, or should I pay you something?
Yeah, we'll license it. We own the trademark for it depends in a computer consulting context. And we actually got the domain also. So we got itdepends.com. My marketing person is not amused. Apparently, it's a bad use of marketing funds. I don't know. It's entertaining for me, so I think that's half the. You got to get through the job somehow. So yeah.
We're getting to the top of the hour. Any challenges that you're going to work on in the next year, like in the Atlassian context?
I think that there's a lot of customers. I would say I think like 3 of our largest customers right now are migrating from on-prem to cloud. Right, the APIs in cloud are wildly different than those in server, especially when it comes to users, especially when it comes to privacy related issues, because Atlassian Cloud has various GDPR capabilities. So I think that as those migrations happen, what's going to happen for us is a certain amount of the integrations that these customers have will need to be rebuilt in various ways, right? Whether that's switching the tooling that's used entirely, or whether that's reconfiguring the tooling to meet new needs. There's a wide variety of challenges, I think, that'll happen there. And part of it is that whenever customers do a on-prem to cloud migration, in my experience, they almost always want to do governance cleanup at the same time. I don't know why. It doesn't actually make
the workflows and everything.
Well, yeah, they're just like, they're like, oh, we're moving from on-prem to cloud. Like, let's make this project harder by also cleaning up all the workflows everyone uses at the same time. Like, okay, I guess, like, I personally don't agree with that. I think you should be doing these changes serially. They're typically like, it becomes a multiplication problem, right? Of like, if you do like one item and one item of work, then it's like, I guess it's like, it's not a good analogy. It's like you do like one item, then second item, then third item of work, you're spending like 3 units of time, right? But if you do 3 by 3, now it's like 9 units of time because you have to cross-check impacts across all of them. So it just gets like way
more complex, right?
Yeah, I think it introduces complexity. I think it introduces a lot of opportunities for mistakes to slip through, and what I would call like unintended, consequences. At the same time, I think that, again, like I said, there's this slope of like appetite for risk, right, and appetite for change, and I think that there is a subset of that population that feels that like I don't like change, but if I have to deal with change, I want to compress all of my change in as little time as possible. And so that's kind of where I think that these two concepts collide. And that's fine, right? That's why they're the customer. We're here to make it work the way they want it to work.
Right.
But what that means from an integration perspective, right? Because again, now we're talking about, hey, we've got these two systems. They need to talk to one another. They need the shared taxonomy. They need the shared understanding of how they work, why they work, etc. And one of them is now doing a massive change, even if they're within the same organization, right? Forget it. I'm not even talking about even within the same organization. So, you just have to understand that, like now, okay, you're doing migration and you're changing the process, and now you've got to reconfigure multiple stakeholders and the integrations, etc. So, I think that there are challenges around that, right? Like, it's the curse and the blessing of being a consultant is that the more broken things get, the more money we make. But at the same time, right? Like consulting is entirely a trust-based business, right? Like if I lose a customer's trust, they'll never buy from me again. So it's important for us to make sure we're setting those expectations up front. It's important to make sure that we're, communicating risk associated with these changes, and empowering the customer to kind of make that informed decision. I think that's the main things that we're thinking about around integration right now. Beyond that, I would say that I think that there's a lot of non-Jira integration stuff that's happening, right? Like Atlassian announced Atlas and Compass during Team. We just started playing with Compass recently in our environment. I don't know if you guys have, but like a lot of that involves CI/CD tooling and monitoring tooling integration back into Compass. I know that we're talking with some companies about even helping them build their integrations into Compass for it. So I think that integration will continue to be at the forefront of what we're dealing with as a business. And then I would also say, like, look, I was an Atlassian employee, right? A good part of my net worth is tied up in Atlassian stock to this day. When I look at Atlassian as a business, I'm wondering, like, okay, why are they actually better than their competitors, right? Like, why do we operate in the Atlassian ecosystem and not like ServiceNow or Monday.com or ServiceNow, right? Like, there's a million of these ecosystems that we could be doing. Why are we in this one? Why is this one actually successful? Like, what creates defensibility for Atlassian as a business? And I think that integrations are a huge part of that, right? That, like, if you deploy Jira and you're happy with Jira, and then let's say you switch CTOs or CIOs, right? And the CIO is like, oh, I like ServiceNow, I don't want Jira, right? Well, what's actually going to defend against that, right? I think that the number one thing is very robust integrations, right? Yeah. If you've got Jira integrated into someone else's Jira, if you've got it integrated into the various user auth, etc., right? If you've got it connected to all your CI/CD tooling, if you've got it connected to your monitoring tooling, if you've got it connected to documentation, etc., you've got this whole suite of things. And now what you're saying, right, is that you want to move the Jira data, fine. But now not only do you need to move the integrations, but you need to move all the business processes connected around these integrations. I think it's a really powerful place to be. And I mean, I can even say that if you look at, Atlas Authority's marketplace, Atlassian Marketplace apps, most are integrations, right? Like we integrate Jira with email, we integrate Jira with Markdown that is mostly remote. We integrate with like Markdown, ASCII doc, diagrams, like all these like remote data types that we bring into content, right? We integrate through iframes. We integrate with Tableau. We integrate with email. Like, what if our apps aren't like? I mean, we do have a few others, but like the majority of our apps are some form of another integration. And I think that if you look at what there is on the marketplace, like sure, there's a few like really rich products at the top. Right, that are like sure, Tempo, right? Tempo is not really integration. Yeah. You have like Tempo, Refined, a few others, right? That are like they have these standalone products. But I think that the large majority of apps truly are some form of integration, one way or another. Yeah. So.
Yeah. No, very interesting. All interesting topics we discussed about today. About the integration, the minimal viable product that the integration should be, like both on the tooling as on the project itself, and how taxonomy can make a difference in a successful project. So yeah, sure. I hope the audience had some interesting ideas out of it. And if you have any questions, we'll provide you links so that you can ask me or Boris or the whole team questions which are particular to your situation. Okay. So
thanks a lot for having me, Francis.
Yeah, thank you for your time. Enjoy Peru, and yeah, hopefully next time. Bye.
Thanks a lot. See you.
Thanks for tuning into Exalate's podcast, Integration Talks, a podcast that covers all things integration. For more information, check out our resources on exalate.com and stay tuned